Hello, 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 and welcome to Alexasrewm, where we are not lawyers, we are not medical professionals, we are not law enforcement, we are just people who have opinions about all things going on in the true crime community, including what the heck is going on with the Ashley Benefield case. Now, if you are unfamiliar with this case, just a quick synopsis. Ashley Benefield is the former Florida ballerina who has been charged with second-degree murder for shooting her late husband, Douglas Benefield, to death in what she claims is an act of self defense. Now, this all happened in 2020, so this trial has been dragging out for 4 years, twice as long as our friends in Norfolk County. It's a lot messier, a lot more complicated than I initially anticipated just with all the media reports. And I think there's a lot that we need to consider. And if you are familiar with this case, I just encourage you to go in with an open mind. As much as I have tried to do, I am someone who is also a survivor of SA. When I was a child, when I was an adult, I've been in toxic relationships with similar power dynamics. So I can definitely relate on a personal level, which is why it was so important for me to just go in with as open as a mind. So I'm not leaning in favor of one side over the other. But I have to say, up until this point, I haven't really seen anything from the prosecution, in my opinion, to prove that Ashley actually intended to end Douglas's life. Now, that might all change. But that being said, the prosecution has said that they are intending to rest their case by tomorrow. We will see. Things could change. Things could get just as spicy as they did today in today's testimony, but we still have to catch up on day one. But before we do, before we get into opening statements and all that, I just want to make a quick disclaimer. If you are somebody who is also a survivor of DVSA or anything, and any of this is, I just want to give a trigger warning because some of the information that is shared during some of the testimony you're going to hear might be upsetting. And if it is, click out, do what you need to do to take care of yourself. We're here for you, and I will see you in the next video. Is no issue. I will do my best to call out those moments throughout the video just so you're prepared. But if you have to check out, don't worry at all. I got you, and I will see you in the next video. Okay, so let's dive into opening statements. First, from the prosecutor.
This case is about a woman who very early on in her pregnancy decided she wanted to be a single mother. And she did not want the father of this child to have any visitation, her husband. And everything she did from that point on was to attain that goal. And she would stop at nothing to attain that goal.
So already they are painting this picture. And again, if you have been following this case, this is likely the narrative that you've seen just widely, the narrative that has been widely shared throughout many media outlets as well too. I know any kind of research that I've done into this case definitely leans more towards this narrative of Ashley was just some kind of young gold digger at the time that she met Douglas Benefield. I believe she was around 23, 24 years old, and he was about 30 years her senior. She met him at a political meeting. So they actually met at a, not a Trump rally, but it was some kind of like donor party that Douglas Benefield was also attending as well too, because Ashley Benefield actually worked for Donald Trump, I think during one of his presidential election campaign. So really interesting. And because we are in the state of Florida, that is primarily a red state, they are not actually allowed to mention Donald Trump's name in this. And I feel like that could go one way or the other, make the jury a little bit more sympathetic towards Ashley because they have common political beliefs, etc. So that is omitted from the testimony. But I just want to give you that context just so you have an idea of just who she is. But again, how they met, a little bit insight into their relationship. But already the prosecution is painting the story of Ashley wanted to be a single mom. She was going to do whatever she needed to do to get what she wanted at all costs. It didn't matter. So let's continue.
She tried several things in the system that you'll hear. The courts, law enforcement, Department of Children and Families, no one got on her side. And at the end, when there was no other option.
And that's also a good point too, because again, depending on which way that is spun, it could look like, well, if she made a concerted effort to get the help, and then she didn't get the help that she needed from all these different agencies and trying to do it the legal way, then yeah, that can look bad in one light. I'm gonna take matter into my own hands, which could be a fair perspective if that's what you believe in.
She shoots him and kills him and claims self-defense. Now, this couple, Doug Benefield and Ashley Benefield, were married. They had moved to Florida from South Carolina. They lived together in South Carolina. Now, when they lived down here in Florida, in Bradenton, they did not live together. Obviously, there were issues. Doug Benefield lived in his own apartment. Ashley Benefield lived with her mother, Alicia Byers, in a home with their daughter. Once she gave birth, she had this daughter who
we will be hearing from Ashley's mother later in today's video as well too, who talks more about this living arrangement of how Ashley even got down from South Carolina to Florida, and how Doug also ended up there as well too, which is really interesting because, again, hearing the testimony compared to how the prosecution lays out the series of events and the narrative that they are going towards to support their case, it's interesting. So just pay attention.
At the time was a toddler when she shot Doug. While they were living separate, they were still interacting with each other with the apparent goal of seeking reconciliation, reconciling this family and becoming a family. They were going to restaurants, they were going to Selby Gardens, they were hanging out at the pool at Doug Benefield's apartment complex. By all images, they looked like they were trying to reconcile. The problem was that is not what Ashley Benefield wanted. Although that's what she was portraying, that's not what she wanted. At the time that the shooting happened, they were planning to move to Maryland. Ashley's mother had inherited a home in Maryland, and they were going to move to Maryland. Doug was also going to move to Maryland. They were going to continue to live separate and continue to attempt to reconcile, but they were all going to move to Maryland together. Excuse me. At the time that this happened, everybody was in moving mode. There were boxes everywhere, furniture.
Also, too, when she said they were all going to move together to Maryland, just make a note of that as well, too, to see if that lines up with future testimony in this video.
Beds upended. They had a U-Haul that they were using together. They had a pod that was in the defendant's driveway that they were putting all of their things into. And every day around this time, Doug Benefield was going to Ashley's home to assist her in putting these things into the pod, putting these things into the U-Haul, because the plan was that they were all going to pack up in the next few days and move to Maryland and continue to try and work on their relationship. The problem was Ashley Benefield knew that this was a ruse. She didn't intend to reconcile. She didn't intend to try to make this work. And the problem was there was a court hearing on September 30th of 2020. And at that court hearing, all of this was going to come out. It was going to come out that she was acting one way when she was by herself, and she was acting another way when she was with Doug Benefield. That she was telling him she wanted to work on things, that she wanted to get this marriage back together. But yet when separate, she was saying she had absolutely no intention of reconciling, did not want him around, and did not want this to work. On the 30th of September, this was going to come out. On the 27th of September, she shoots him and kills him. 3 days before this hearing and 3 days before this information was to become public. Now, there was no one else at the house at the time of the shooting. It was just Doug and Ashley. While Ashley's mother and child lived there, they had gone to the park. As soon as Doug got to the house, Alicia Byers takes her granddaughter and they go to the park. So
you see what she's doing there too, is she's setting the stage for Ashley and Doug were there alone. As soon as they pull up and are getting ready to pack up the U-Haul, I'm assuming, I guess what they're alluding to is Ashley told her mom to take her daughter to the park while her and Doug were packing up the U-Haul. That's what I gather from that. That's what it seems like she's alluding to there.
The only people at the house are the defendant and the victim. And you're going to hear three very important things about this shooting. Number one, Ashley Benefield was the only person that was armed. It was her gun. She had it from before. It's not like she took it away from Doug. It was her gun. And Doug Benefield was not armed. He had no gun, no knife, no club, no weapon of any kind. Number two, Ashley Benefield was not injured. Law enforcement took pictures of her right after the shooting. And then again, you'll hear in a few days, they took more pictures. Because sometimes law enforcement, they know that bruises sometimes don't show up right away, that it takes several days for these bruises to show up. So they took pictures several days later. And you'll see those pictures, and you'll see that Ashley Benefield is not injured. She has some very superficial scratches on her midsection. Who knows where they came from? She had cats in the house.
She had cats in the house. Who knew? There's something later on that comes out about involving a cat that's just deeply upsetting. So I will also try and give a trigger warning there as well too, because I am a freakishly big cat lover, and it was just disturbing to hear that part of testimony. But what I feel like doesn't necessarily make sense for me with this, just with this narrative of, well, Ashley didn't have any bruises on her. Okay, well, eh, for the stand your ground law to work, and grant now I know they already had the stand your ground hearing where the defense filed a motion to dismiss this charge, and this was ultimately denied by the judge after that 2-day hearing. But I find it interesting because it really just means that if you feel like your personal safety is in danger, I mean, you could be walking down the street, and if you feel like, somebody's following you, or somebody approaches you, a sketchy figure, maybe they corner you, but they don't necessarily put hands on you. Maybe they have, a gun and they're pointing at you, and you feel threatened in any way, or threatening to pull out a gun at you and hurt you or harm you. So I don't necessarily agree with that. Granted, though, the narrative that the defense is going to go with is that Ashley is a DV victim. She has been a DV victim for years. Douglas Benefield had violent tendencies as well too, where she was in fear of her life. So whether or not he had actually put his hands on her in that moment or not doesn't necessarily isn't necessarily relevant. So again, just to give you some kind of context of where the defense is going to go versus where the prosecution is going with their case, and which makes more sense to you. But I feel like, yes, this could be slightly stronger, but doesn't necessarily matter if she actually had bruises or not on her body that day, if she was actually physically attacked, if she felt like her personal safety was endangered. And that could mean a lot of things too, right? So let's continue to go through opening statements for the prosecution.
But this is the only injury to her. And the third thing is the trajectory of the fatal bullet. Now, he was shot multiple times, but one of the bullets was fatal. The trajectory of that bullet was side to side. It was not straight on. Doug Benefield was not facing her, coming at her at the time that the fatal shot was fired. Now, as you go...
So that's another important point as well, too.
It was not straight on. Doug Benefield of the fatal bullet. Now, he was shot multiple times, but one of the bullets was fatal. The trajectory of that bullet was side to side. It was not straight on.
So that's also interesting too, because for me, I feel like especially because they're alleging that Ashley was this person who was well versed in handling GUNs. She owned her own firearm as well too. So but in that moment of panic, or in that moment of potential struggle, I could see a world where she wouldn't be able to necessarily get a clear shot, whether she was scared, nervous, wasn't holding the GUN right, or not because she didn't know how to use it. I definitely think we can all agree she knew how to use it, but in that moment of distress, could there have been something else going on? Because if she was cool, calm, and collected and intended to do this, why not just get him straight on, right? So that's also something else I found interesting about that, because I up until this point I didn't know that. The way that the media seemed to have spun it was that he had his back turned and then he turned around, but never, at least from what I've seen or heard, from at least what little research I've done. Again, I've tried to kind of go into this very open-minded and more as a juror, just kind of receiving the information that's coming into the trial, not what's necessarily been reported beforehand. But I find it interesting that where he was shot was on his two sides, not directly in the middle.
Doug Benefield was not facing her, coming at her at the time that the fatal shot was fired. Now, as you go through this trial, it's a lot of information, a lot of timeline, but it's all very important to understand the tenor of this relationship between these two people. And it goes all the way back to when they met, back in 2016. That was the end of August 2016, they meet. They were both involved in some political event, and they met. 13 days later, they married. Doug Benefield was 54 years old. Ashley Benefield was 24 years old.
Like, I mean, I know you have to say that, but I feel like too, especially if the jurors are older. I mean, that's probably something that's gonna make them who like think, "Oh my god, my daughter, like, is he taking advantage of her?" So I feel like, yes, you need to address that, and there's no way to dance around the fact that there was a power dynamic, there was an age difference, and not that there's anything wrong with that at all. My aunt and my uncle are 10 years apart. I know plenty of people. I've also dated people who are, 20 plus years my senior, as well too, so call it what you want. But I again, just speaking to, the jury, different people might interpret that as something that could be more helpful to the defense, even though it's opening statements, it's not evidence, but still, it's information that's going into the jury's ears, and it might make their wheels start spinning about already making their own um, judgments and reservations about the potential case.
So there was a 30-year age gap between the two of them. They knew each other 13 days and they got married. Ashley Benefield was very into the ballet, had been an ex-dancer. Her dream was to start a ballet company. And lo and behold, her husband has the money and the connections to get this done. So he begins and she begins to put this ballet company together. And they do put a ballet company together. But before it can actually take off, it falls apart. Before they're married even a whole year, so in April of 2017, Doug Benefield has his vasectomy reversed because they want a child. Within weeks or months of the vasectomy reversal, the defendant is pregnant. So all within a year of being married, they have done a vasectomy reversal, gotten pregnant, started a ballet, and the ballet has crumbled. While Ashley is pregnant, she decides she's too sick from the pregnancy, morning sickness, and that she needs her mother to take care of her. Her mother's in Florida, in Bradenton, Florida. So during her pregnancy, she moves to Bradenton, Florida to live with her mother so her mother can take care of her during the sickness. The two never lived together again. This was the last time these two lived together. They continued a long distance relationship when she first moved to Florida and continued trying to keep it together in communication. But about the same time as the ballet collapses, right about all of this time, Ashley Benefield starts complaints against the victim. Her complaints are things like, the main one was that Doug Benefield was poisoning her with heavy metals and her unborn child was being poisoned, that there was poison in her tea, that he was giving her poison. There were also other complaints, domestic violence complaints, different types of complaints, but not once will you hear that she ever said he hit her. Not once did she ever say he choked her, kicked her, anything like that.
Well, I mean, aside from that Good Morning America interview, she really hadn't spoken out at all. According to testimony, she didn't even speak to the police. She just called right for an attorney, not to future pace or spoil anything too far ahead, too. But so I also find that interesting, and the poisoning is going to be a big part of this case as well, too, especially with day 2 when they start getting into again more of their relationship. They even bring in Douglas Benefield's attorney for family court when they were going through custody battles over their daughter. So again, this case is messy. There's a lot of layers to it, and that's why I encourage you not to rush to judgment right away, but to really just sit with the evidence that is presented and then come up, as always, with your own opinion. It's always respectful. We're always open to respectful discussion and debate in the comment section. But yeah, that the poisoning, I mean, they're making her out to seem like she is this crazy woman, which kind of mirrors, again, the hysterical. You're going to see, in a weird way, some mirroring between this case and the Karen Reed case. Not necessarily in the sense of, how the series of events unfolded. In this case, we know who was the one who ended Douglas Benefield's life. There's no debate or question about that. But whether or not she intended to do it. Whereas with the Karen Reed case, we know Karen Reed is factually innocent based on the evidence or lack thereof evidence that has been presented in the Commonwealth's case. So again, just all things to take note of. I know it sounds crazy, but the way I know it's a lot to keep track of, but stick with me. Stick with me. It's only going to get even crazier and wilder from here, but they're already trying to paint her out as and I also don't really like how the prosecution is like, "Oh, Ashley, she was experiencing morning sickness and she needed her mother. Like it's a bad thing. Like she needed her mom. I don't really know a lot about her personal background, about her relationship to her father, but it seems like he wasn't part of. I don't know if he passed away when she was younger, but it does seem like there might have been some abandonment issues. Not that I'm diagnosing by any means, but that's kind of the way that it seems like that there might have been some growing up to do. I mean, I remember when I was 23, 24. Like now that I'm almost 30, my gosh, it is a big difference between now and then. And I believe now Ashley Benefield is 32. She's in her 30s as well too. So the way that your brain matures, but also too going through morning sickness. I have never experienced that, but I am an aunt, a new aunt, and I remember my sister's pregnancy and all of the just trauma her body just went through during that pregnancy, and so many other women too. So and suffering from postpartum. So all things to consider, and not necessarily just to glaze over, but you'll see that a lot with the prosecution. They'll glaze over certain things and try to over exaggerate, like, oh, she needed her mommy, and it's kind of almost in a condescending way. So again, I encourage you to go in with an open mind and listen to all the evidence, just as I will too, because again, the prosecution still has more testimony, more witnesses to call tomorrow, but this is just from opening statements.
Even though she's making these complaints, the victim, Doug Benefield, is still trying to make this work. And you're going to see some text messages and hear some things. He's still trying to make this work. But she is having none of it. So at about the time that she's ready to give birth, Doug Benefield contacts an attorney here in Florida, Sarasota, Florida, Stephanie Murphy, and asks her to help. And asks her to help him write a letter to her, to Ashley Benefield, to state that he wants to be a part of the birth and he wants to be a part of this child's life.
A letter that was actually an email, but we'll get into Stephanie Murphy's testimony. My God, that was a highlight of today.
And to please keep in contact with him. Ashley never answers that letter. That letter is sent via email on March 15th of 2018, which was several weeks early. She wasn't due yet. And the next day, she is induced. Her pregnancy is induced, and she gives birth to a daughter. She never tells Doug. He doesn't even know his child is born for weeks. And she never responds to the letter. The way that Doug knows that this child is born is that Ashley Benefield starts filing complaints again. And
which again kind of like falls in line with if you are to believe that Ashley Benefield is a survivor of DV and she was actually in fear of her safety from Douglas Benefield, like that would make sense to me, ignoring your a user's sorry, I gotta like be careful about certain words because YouTube doesn't, as you know, YouTube doesn't like certain words. So but her the man who is causing harm to her and making her feel like her life and now her child's life is in danger, yeah, it would make sense that she's dodging him, she's not answering his calls, maybe she moves away. I mean, again, it doesn't sound super suspicious to me, but again, I feel like if you haven't gone through something similar like this, it's a little harder to believe, and it seems like, well, yeah, she's just, a gold digging, bitch, and she, doesn't care, and she's icing him out, but again, we'll see.
Based on these complaints, he figures out, oh, my child's born. And now we have more complaints. The complaints revolved around the poisoning and the things that I talked about earlier. And she filed for what's called a violation of injunction, or I'm sorry, she filed for an injunction. An injunction is our legal way of saying restraining order. So when someone wants a restraining order, they have to go through a process and go to court, and the court has to decide, and you get a restraining order. So that was her process. She was trying to get a restraining order against Doug, and the allegations were what I said to you. At the same time,
she doesn't want to repeat it.
Had not met his child. So he did a cross complaint to say, please let me have contact with my child. I've never even met my child. So this was set for a hearing. And it ended up going 2 days. It was long. It was a long process, a lot of witnesses in family court. And it ended up going 2 days. It began in July 30th, 2018, and it finished on September 17th, 2018. And at the conclusion of that hearing, the judge said, no. No, you are not getting a restraining order, and no, you cannot keep this man away from his child. And granted Doug Benefield immediate visitation with his daughter. He met his daughter for the first time. She was 6 months old. And at the time, when they were exchanging custody, which was at the sheriff's office for meeting the child, all of this animus had been going on. I mean, they just had these hearings and all of this. And at that first time sharing, that's what they call it nowadays in family courts, time sharing. At the first time sharing, Ashley starts becoming very nice to Doug and says, basically, I'll go with you for the visitation. And that's what they did.
Which, again, I mean, if you're afraid of that person and you have no choice because you share a child with that person, like, what are you gonna do? You're gonna be mean to them? Like, now you're not only responsible for the safety of yourself, but your child as well too, and of course you would go along and monitor that visit yourself. You would wanna be a part of that. I can only imagine how confusing it was, and again, a lot of this stems from my own personal call me bias, this, that, and the third. I'm still trying to go in with an open mind, but again, from a lot of what I'm hearing, it's not super strange behavior to me because I have personally been through a very similar power dynamic relationship with someone that was a former mentor of mine, and not getting into it, not sharing all the personal details. But again, I can understand trying to make it work because you feel just trapped and not knowing what to do. So, and just trying to be nice about it because you don't know what's gonna happen. Um, so
Yeah. The family goes off for visitation. And that begins approximately a year, of basically them working on the relationship, going out to restaurants, doing things, hanging out together as a family. About a year. Now, Doug never moves in with Ashley. He keeps a separate residence. But after August of 2018, Ashley just stops talking to him.
sorry, that's the court TV video.
Doug files.
I don't know if this is how it was
The defendant started.
yesterday. I watched it on Law and Crime, and I know Law and Crime sometimes flags it for copyright, so I want to make sure.
With 5 different complaints, all revolving not around her this time, but about the child, because there's visitation with the child. So now these using the child.
See if we can skip ahead a little bit.
We're going to work on our relationship and try and make this family work. When she's not with Doug, she's saying, no, now I do not want to reconcile with him. And to Doug's knowledge, all he's hearing is, so that's what he knows. Was coming out on the 30th. September 30th, Ashley knew the ruse was up. Now, there had to be a request from both sides, the husband and the wife, this psychological report. And at one point before the hearing, Ashley Benefield tried to get Doug to drop that so the report would not get out, would not be released. Doug refused. So that report was coming out on the 30th, and on the 27th, she kills him and claims self-defense. Now, you're probably going to hear a lot of information about Doug Benefield. Probably some negative things, not so nice things. I would just ask you to remember who and why. Just because someone speaks words does not make it true. So use your common sense as you go through this trial. This is a long story with a lot of information, but you'll see that this was a custody battle that this mother was going to win at all costs. And the cost was the life of Doug Benefield. And that is murder. Thank you.
So, I mean, she's right. Like, just because somebody, says this happened to me. I mean, we've seen it in Depp versus Heard, which is deeply upsetting because it's upsetting when any woman comes forward and is lying about being a survivor of DV when they in fact haven't. In that case, Amber Heard was the person who was the one causing harm towards Johnny Depp, and physically harming him, but which makes it difficult for people who are actually survivors to come forward and share their stories. So it is deeply upsetting, and that's why we have to tread carefully in this case. But that being said, there is documented proof that will come out in testimony proving that Douglas Benefield did have violent tendencies, and that, in fact, he did at one time put his hands on Ashley Benefield, causing her head, I think, to swell. So again, lots of saddening stuff. trigger pulled stuff. If you have to step away, totally get it. I will see you in the next video. But we're gearing up now to get to the defense's opening statements. So hopefully it's not as glitchy as it was on the prosecution.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Douglas Benefield. He was 58 when Ashley Benefield was forced to shoot him. Can I see the second picture, please?
Can I actually speed him up a little more because he does speak
I
slow.
want you to note how he's built for a 58-year-old man. Now, despite being raised by a family who taught me that it was ill to speak about the dead in an unflattering sense, I'm going to have some strong words about Douglas Benefield, the alleged victim in this case. I say alleged victim because he was anything but that. The evidence is going to show that Douglas Benefield was a very disturbed man. Of that, I assure you, you'll have no doubt when the case is over. 30 years older than Ashley, he was obsessed with her, and he successfully portrayed himself as everything he was not in an effort to win her hand in marriage. Despite promoting himself as a religious and decent human being, Doug Benefield was a manipulative, cunning, and abusive man, absolutely insisted on control. Among other things, you're going to learn during this trial that over the course of this 4-year relationship, Douglas Benefield did the following. He fired a handgun into the ceiling of their kitchen on an occasion to stop Ashley from talking. He threw a loaded gun at Ashley. He punched Doug in the face so hard that he knocked the dog unconscious.
So he punched a dog in the face. I'm sorry. I know it's been a little glitchy here, so I couldn't give the trigger warning. But yeah, none of that was brought up. That was kind of glazed over in the prosecution's opening statement. Whereas I feel like almost in a way, not to compare the two, because, you know, I obviously am not alleging that Trooper Proctor has done anything remotely like that. I don't know. I don't know the man. I don't know if he has violent tendencies. But in terms of how Lally addressed that situation, because he had no choice but to address things head on, I feel like the prosecution kind of missed their opportunity to just be straightforward and honest about it instead of just glazing over it and trying to minimize that portion of it, because it is going to come out. You know, anything that the defense or the prosecution says in their opening is likely going to be or should be supported by actual factual evidence that comes into play later on in future testimony. So if this is the first time we're hearing it and the prosecution isn't the one to address it, feels like you're kind of hiding something, right? And I get it. It's hard for people to sympathize with somebody who might be a piece of human waste. However, just because they are a piece of human waste doesn't mean that their life deserves to be ended necessarily. Doesn't mean that we take matter into our own hands. And again, that is the card that the prosecution has to prove. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to unfold.
He regularly carried a concealed firearm that was racked, meaning pulled back and ready to fire. He unlawfully placed a tracker on Ashley Benefield's vehicle. He was regularly observed following Ashley Benefield in her car, driving in Manatee and Sarasota counties, despite the fact that he was living in South Carolina, having driven all the way just to tail her. He was caught by a neighbor at night, standing in the neighbor's backyard in an effort to peer into Ashley's house. He punched numerous holes in the drywall of their home when they lived together in South Carolina. And he had a previous marital history of domestic violence. Ashley Benefield was painfully aware.
And that comes out. That comes out later on with, I believe, his second wife, Renee, so he was married 3 times. The first, I believe, when he was very young. I don't think anything comes out necessarily with the first wife, but the second wife, Renee, passed away 9 months before him and Ashley Benefield get married and meet for those 13 days, and they get married in a whirlwind romance. And I think I don't know who the text thread is. I can't recall off the top of my head, but there is a text thread between his wife, ex-wife Renee, or late wife Renee, with somebody else talking about their honeymoon and how he had kicked her really hard and really hurt during their honeymoon. So again, there are receipts that back that up as well too. This isn't a guy who, and this is why I struggle with it so much, because it's like you can be a victim of one crime, but that doesn't mean that you aren't a monster yourself. And this is why I struggle. This is why this case is so fascinating to me. And it's just so different than the Karen Reed case
They're
in a lot
all
of
of this.
ways.
On
It
September
mirrors it
27th,
too.
2020, the day of the homicide. And I want to assure you that this is not going to come to you from just one place. These are acts that were admitted by Douglas Benefield himself.
Yeah.
Ashley Benefield feared him. That was no secret, ladies and gentlemen. She left him a letter when she moved out 3 years prior to the homicide, detailing how scared she was of him because of all of these acts. She feared for herself and for her unborn child. 3 years before the shooting. She left him. He pursued her. She rejected him. He would not take no for an answer. She at times despised him. He did not care. She moved to get away from him. He followed her. She decided to go to Maryland. Surprise. He decided to go to Maryland as well. She belonged to him. He had the right to be with her, and no less than God decided that to be the case. Doug Benefield viewed Ashley Benefield as his property. Abusers seek to control their victims, to dominate them. At times, the pressure that Doug Benefield exerted and brought to bear upon Ashley Benefield was so overwhelming that it sometimes triggered questionable suspicions in Ashley's dedicated effort to protect herself and her child. Domestic violence victims have several things in common. Number one, they initially believe things will get better. Instead, they get worse. Number two, domestic violence victims develop a get along, go along attitude. It's the mentality, because appeasement keeps the beast at bay. Just do what he wants and you'll be safe. These domestic violence victims constantly speak about walking on eggshells. And the reason they describe it like that is for fear of anything that they say may trigger a reprisal by the abuser. And if children are involved, everything is magnified. They become hyper-vigilant. Ashley Benefield developed all of those characteristics.
I mean that, and just like, again, speaking from some of my own personal experiences as well too, with just the one the one relationship I was in. Sometimes I don't even know if I can call it a relationship, because it wasn't. It was a mentor of mine who I trusted, who I had invested financially and personally, like my own time, um, in guidance and helping me navigate through the profession I was looking to enter into, and he took advantage of that. I was 19 at the time. He claims he was in his 30s, but I knew for a dang fact that he was in his 40s, which, again, if it's consensual, that's fine. Like, I'm not judging anybody at all by any means, but it wasn't. I remember feeling constantly trapped, depressed, and feeling like, even though it wasn't necessarily physically he wasn't physically harmful towards me, he was very intimidating, very manipulative, and very verbally aggressive towards me, tried to isolate me from my friends, my family, especially. It was a really, really difficult time. And I get it, like, trying to appease. And sometimes I felt like I had to live like two separate lives and hide, like, trying to live a normal life, because he was in a different state than I was. And I lived back home on Long Island. And I felt like I had to almost live two lives, and I couldn't share that. And it's just messy, it's messed up. And again, that's why it makes this case so interesting to me, because yeah, that makes sense. Like, I get trying to make the peace and just trying to knock on their nerves or say the wrong thing, because if they do, then you don't know how they're going to act out. And in my personal experience, even though the threat wasn't my physical safety necessarily, the threat was on my success in my career, which he made pretty present, and it was terrifying to me as a 19-year-old who was excited to get into this specific industry. So
On 9/27/2020, the day of the homicide, Doug arrives at the residence of Ashley Benefield. And as you heard, they are living separately. He does not live there. He never resided there. This is at her home in Bradenton. He had no claim for entering that home on that day, except with the permission of Ashley, which she gave on that day because she was moving to Maryland and Doug was going to Maryland as well. But he knew, make no mistake, as the prosecutors told you, Doug Benefield knew full well on that day that this relationship was over. They were not going to be living together. Maybe, hopefully, they could work out some type of co-parenting agreement, but she was done. So how does that day's events unfold? What happens that results in us all assembling here this morning? It starts, ladies and gentlemen, with Doug Benefield once again seeking control. He is simmering when he arrives at Ashley's home on that afternoon. Why is he simmering? He's on a slow boil, actually, because he knows that Ashley's moving. He knows that this relationship is over. And immediately there's a discussion about how they should pack the belongings, with Ashley taking the position that her belongings should be packed last. Why? Because Ashley's things are going to be unloaded first, and Doug will then continue on to wherever it is that he was going to reside. So this is the most vulnerable time for a domestic violence victim, when the abuser recognizes that he's about to lose her. So what's his response to this? All right, classic tactics of an abuser, they are threats and intimidation on this afternoon as the two of them are trying to pack this U-Haul in this pod. In an effort to avoid confrontation with him, Ashley says after a short while, gee, I'm really pretty exhausted. Why don't we stop for the day? We can finish tomorrow. Doug ignores it. His response is to grow increasingly aggressive and hostile. Not once, but twice, Doug body checks Ashley. And by body check, I mean he passes her in the hallway, slams his shoulder into her shoulder, almost knocking her over. That's not enough. The next thing is, as they're passing in a hallway, he's carrying a cardboard box. He jams the cardboard box into Ashley's side, which leaves scratches that the police photographer took. Again.
So he's saying that the scratches on her side were caused by the cardboard box being slammed into her side. There were pictures taken of it, whereas the prosecution said it could have came from her cat, which I mean, my cat doesn't scratch, so I don't know. my cat lovers out there in the channel, in this community, has your cat ever scratched you in the side? I mean, I guess it's possible, but I just feel like it's kind of like it's just kind of like I don't know, just kind of a way to glaze over it.
Now fearing for her,
but a very, very different narrative, as you can see.
Safety, because she sees how he is escalating in his behavior. She tries to persuade him, look, let's finish for the day. It's getting late. I'm tired. No go. Instead, Doug bellows, I know what you're doing. You're trying to get me to leave. I'm your husband, and I can spend the night if I want to. Well, that was enough for Ashley. She heads for the front door of the house to leave. Doug chases up to her, grabs her by the arm or hand, and spins her around so that his back is to the front door, blocking her from leaving. And he yells right in her face, where do you think you're going? Ashley, desperate at this point, Doug yells, you can't leave me. Ashley somehow finds the strength to summon up the nerve to say, I am done. You need to leave now. She commands him to leave the home. Terrified, while in his grasp, because he spun her around, his response is to smack her upside the head. And you'll see the pictures of her swollen face and her eye. And he yells, I am not done. Fearing for her life.
Whereas the prosecution, remember, said that she didn't have any physical signs of physical injuries, or and how the crime scene techs, I believe, came back to take pictures a few days later, because bruises sometimes take a few days to show.
As this was the first time that he had actually struck her. Up till then, it was always threats and intimidation. As intimidating as firing a gun may be to get you to stop speaking, he had never actually hit her. He pushed her. This time he struck her. Terrified after this, fearing for her life, she heads for her bedroom where she has a firearm. She gets to the firearm. She turns around. She orders Doug to stop. When she looks up, he's in the doorway. Instead of seeing the gun and leaving, Doug gets into this warrior pose with his arms moving purposely and advances. At that point, petrified, she fires, believing that if he gets a hold of her, she will be either seriously injured or killed. To her horror, after firing, he continues to advance. She absolutely panics. She tries to get away and backs to the side to create more distance between them, but there is no place left for her to go in this small bedroom. At that point, in utter panic, she keeps firing the gun. She sees Doug's legs go up in the air, almost as if he was running and slipped, and he falls backwards. Instinctively, she flees the house and heads next door to John Sand's house. He's a neighbor. When all is said and done, ladies and gentlemen, and the testimony and the evidence is complete, the only thing that's going to have been established here beyond a reasonable doubt is that Douglas Benefield was a violent abuser. Ashley Benefield's efforts to placate him was absolutely consistent with what abused women do, especially when a child is involved, and that Ashley's result and resource to deadly force was absolutely justified under the circumstances. Thank you.
So, I mean, I will give it to both prosecution and defense. I feel like both had pretty quick, concise, got to the point, no lollygagging. If I know I keep putting this on and off, it's like cold, hot, cold, hot. Um, but both of them got through it. I mean, yeah, we had him on 1.75x speed because he is a slower talker. But what do you think? Who do you think? I guess one, in terms of opening statements, the prosecution or defense. Again, I mean, you can look at it from either way, but from the perspective that the defense painted the story, it seems like they were a little bit more specific about the series of events and how things kind of went down, where I feel like the prosecution kind of just quickly glazed over, like, oh, they were in the house and they started arguing, and then she took out the gun. She started she took out the gun and she started firing. So, from me, I felt like the defense did a better job just kind of tightening up the series of events and just making it a little bit clearer in my brain to picture how things may have went down. And it does make sense because we learned that Douglas Benefield actually had a background in he also used to be part of, I believe, the Navy as well too. We're going to hear from his cousin Tommy Benefield. He's actually the first witness that is called. But to be brutally honest, I don't think his testimony nor Eva Benefield's testimony was all super relevant. In fact, I felt like bringing Eva Benefield, even though she is older now, she is an adult at the time of this event. At the time that this took place, she was about 15 years old, and it felt like the prosecution was just really subjecting her to something that she never really witnessed. Obviously, it's her father. She had a great relationship. That's what she testifies to. She had a great relationship to her dad. At first, she seemed to get along with Ashley, and then over time, she didn't really like that Ashley was stepping into the role of mom. But granted, Ashley was also 24 and she really didn't know how to step into necessarily maybe the role of mom herself. Eva also just lost her mom 9 months prior. So, again, it makes sense that there would be a really complicated relationship between Eva and Ashley for a number of reasons, and why she may not have liked her, and why she may not like her today, or why she might not be inclined to necessarily believe Ashley over her father. And it's just incredibly sad to see. I think the biggest thing that came out of Eva's testimony is the fact that she confirms that she did see holes in the wall. Her dad was the one to patch up the holes in the wall. She did see, signs of the aftermath of some of these events that the defense just mentioned in their opening statements. So it kind of confirms that, yeah, he did have violent tendencies, and these over time that can escalate. And just because this was the first time that he may have actually touched her doesn't mean that that would have been the last time that he did going forward. So it does definitely complicate things, in my opinion, for the prosecution, and just in terms of the characterization of Douglas Benefield. And I know that's hard to do. I know it's hard to do because he might not come off as a likable person to maybe the people of the jury, but these are things that you can't glaze over. And if you do, it makes it really hard to not think that you aren't hiding something. I'm going to end things here for today just because it's getting super late here. The video is already getting extremely long. What do you think about the opening statement? But nevertheless, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss another video from me. And make sure you hit that like button because it teaches the YouTube algorithm that this news is newsworthy. And I think especially in this regard, because it is a DV case. No matter which way you fall, no matter which side you land on, whether you think Ashley is innocent, whether you think or innocent in regards to she did it out of self-defense, whether you believe that that Ashley did this on purpose, that it was intentional. Whatever way you swing it, nevertheless, it seems like this was a DV toxic relationship between the two. It does seem like Doug did have some violent tendencies, and that he could have been potentially harmful to whoever he was in a relationship to. But whether or not Ashley intended to end his life or not, that is up to the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Always open to respectful discussions in the comment section below. We can disagree, guys. We can agree to disagree, and it's okay. It's okay to have differing opinions, but please, nevertheless, I know we have survivors in the community, so please be kind. Please be respectful. And I will see you in the next video.